So the next speaker is Christianna Otto. Christiana's advisors are Professor Katharina Schuchman and Matt Carlson. She's a major in Spanish and linguistics. But a really nice fact about Christiana is that she's also pursuing an integrated master's in TESOL, in teaching English to speakers of other languages. And she traveled to Nijmegen and to conduct the study entitled Crosstalker Perceptual Learning in a Second Language. Please join me in welcoming Christiana.
Hi everyone. So I put my pictures at the beginning, which is like the opposite of what everyone else did. But yeah, so here are just some fun pictures from my time in the Netherlands, which was pretty amazing. So here's me inside of a wooden clog, and also I ate a lot of really, really tasty things when I was over there, but raw herring was not one of those things. So that's a picture of me eating raw herring before I knew what it tasted like. Yeah, but I'd like to go ahead and just jump right into this study. So whether we know it or not, variation in speech is all around us. That could be just like we're talking to someone who speaks a different dialect than us, or we just hear someone who just sounds a little bit different than us in general, like they have idiolectal features. And this variation presents a challenge to our perceptual system in that we have to reconcile the differences between what we're actually hearing and what's actually stored in our mind. And perceptual learning is a way that we can overcome this challenge of variation as we receive feedback from the lexicon that we can adjust these phoneme boundaries that we have in our mind because they are flexible in nature, and this makes an otherwise very slow process faster because now we don't have to continually adjust every time we hear words that are spoken. We also know that this perceptual learning process is a little bit constrained in nature. For instance, if I'm talking with a pen in my mouth, then you're not going in that. Well, I'm going to sound different if I'm talking with a pen in my mouth, but as soon as I take that pen out of my mouth, I'm not going to sound the same anymore, so you're not going to expect me to sound the same as when I was talking with the pen in my mouth. But if the variation is due to some other kind of lasting cause, like a dialect or a foreign accent or something like that, then it's very beneficial for me to adapt to that way of talking. And we know that this learning of novel features occurs readily, but if it's useful for learning to be generalized across the lexicon, then it would also be beneficial for us to be able to take what we learned about one talker, and then if we know that this other person sounds the same, that we would be able to generalize that learning from one person to the next. But it's interesting because we've seen in the past that first language speakers are generally hesitant to generalize learned features from one speaker to another. But we also know that this generalization is facilitated with acoustic similarity between voices or with increased exposure to the variation in general. But what's extremely relevant for this study is how does perceptual learning work in a second language, because we don't just experience variation within our first language, we also experience it when we're talking in our second language. And what we currently know is, number one, that perceptual learning is possible within a second language, and it's also been proposed that perhaps bilingualism in general increases the flexibility in spoken word recognition, so maybe what we would expect is that bilingual listeners will be just better able to accommodate variation in general through this perceptual learning process. So the main questions associated with this study was, number one, do second language listeners perceptually adjust to unfamiliar variation in their second language? And if they do, how do they learn to generalize that learning from one speaker to another? So to investigate this, we had two dialect creation full category shifts. So what I mean by that is we changed all S sounds to F sounds and all is sounds to S sounds in the first dialect, and then we also did the opposite of that just to account for any kind of effects that might have been associated with the direction of the change. And we had two main portions of the experiment. One was a potential listening task, and then the other was a series of cross-modal priming tasks. In the potential listening task, in the first phase of cross-modal priming, they were exposed to the first speaker, and then in the last two phases of cross-modal priming, they were exposed to the second speaker. And then I have some examples, maybe, of the potential listening task here.
You pour my coffee, I'll recommit to waking up.
So that would be the first dialect, and then here would be the other one.
pour my coffee, I'll recommit to waking up.
So those are examples of the sentences that listeners might have heard, and it provided a meaningful context for listeners to adjust to this variation. And cross-modal priming is really where we started to investigate whether this perceptual learning process is happening. We've seen from this article by McQueen et al. In 2006 that when listeners are instructed to make a response as to whether the word on the screen that they're shown is or is not a word, and the word that they hear immediately beforehand is exactly the same as the word that they see on the screen, their response time will be faster compared to when the word that they hear immediately beforehand differs in just one sound from the word that they see on the screen. So what we would expect is for listeners to have slower reaction times at the beginning as they hear these words that differ in this one sound, but as they begin to associate this altered phone with what the representation on the screen or what they have stored is, that their response times would get faster as a result. And that's what we see in this first phase of cross-modal priming. So this is just adaptation to the first talker. And so we see that up here on the top, it's slower, and then down here on the bottom, this is faster response times. And these are just the unmodified sounds, so we see a lot, like, there's a lot of priming for these sounds at the beginning. We see for to and it to the vowels here. So this is like the beginning of each trial thing, and then this is the end of the phase. They increase in priming, and these vowels have more priming at the beginning than these consonants do. And we also see the S to F experiences a lot of priming by the end of it. So yeah, priming is generally stronger for vowels than consonants, and after this we don't see any effects of trial order throughout phase 3A or phase 3B. This graph right here shows the generalization to the second talker. So here we see that priming remains stronger for vowels than for consonants, and that this priming remains stable throughout phase 3A and phase 3B, which is just that generalization to the second talker, which shows us that they didn't have to restart this whole perceptual learning process when they heard the second talker. They were able to take what they already knew and apply it to this other person. So what does this all mean? One, it shows that second language listeners do perceptually adjust to variation in their second language, and that they do so in a very robust manner. Also, second language listeners can easily generalize learning from one person to another, which is significant compared to that of when people are just talking in their first language. And vowels may be easier to perceptually adjust to than consonants, at least within the variation that we presented of this full category shift. And yeah, so we also had some translational things in our study. We included a language history questionnaire at the end in which we asked participants to respond about their amount of experience, or how much their teachers instructed them about dialects of English as they were going through school and learning English, and how much they thought that this instruction impacted their ability to use their second language. And what they generally reported was that they had not received a ton of instruction about dialects of English, and whatever instruction they did have, they didn't think had very much impact on them as second language users. But it's interesting because they were still able to adapt in this very robust manner despite reporting such little instruction and impact. So some further questions that we can investigate is, do second language learners or listeners simply just accept more variability within their second language, and how might this affect their ability to learn difficult contrasts within their second language? How might this process be different across proficiency levels? And could instruction and experience with different dialects of English actually help them as they go on to speak their second language, because we've seen this generalization process. Yeah. Thanks to everyone who helped make this possible. I didn't have an explicit thank you slide, so I'm sorry. But yeah, I can take any questions that you guys might have now.